Good morning. So, in the last lecture we have seen what is a transaction, what are the different operations we are going to perform in transaction, and most important thing is what are the properties that a transaction should carry. So, after that you need to discuss about the states in transaction. We are starting a transaction, so it is going to see all these kinds of states. Okay, so see here, so how many states do we have here? So we have active, partially committed, committed state, failed state and terminated state. Okay, so when a transaction is said to be started or when it is said to be committed or when a transaction can be in a termination state. Okay, so now we will see about each and every state in a transaction. So let us begin with an active state, the first one. What is the first state? Any transaction when we are beginning, it will be entering into the active state by default. Okay, this is the default state. So why I am calling this as a default state is when we are starting, when we are about to start any transaction, it will automatically enter into which state? Into active state. Okay, a transaction is said to be active if it starts executing its instructions. Okay, so let me be very clear. What is a transaction? A transaction is nothing but set of operations. So I will write what are the set of operations here. So let us say that I want to transfer 100 rupees from account A to account B. Okay, so account A to account B, I want to transfer 100 rupees, and let us assume that A consists of 200 and B consists of 100 rupees. Okay, so this is the assumption I am making. So what is a transaction here? Set of instructions. What could be the instructions here? First we need to access. Okay, so how many operations we have here? The first one is accessing, means reading. Okay, read and write are the two important operations that we perform in a transaction. Okay, so first we are accessing, we have to access the account details, read of A. Then what is the action you need to perform? You are crediting 100 rupees. Okay, means when you are giving 100 rupees to account B, what is supposed to happen here? So 100 rupees should be debited from your account. Means, so what is instruction I need to write? A equal to A minus 100, because I am giving away 100 rupees to B. So then you need to update. Update means write operation. Okay, reading is nothing but accessing the information, writing is nothing but updating the information. So write of A. So is this enough? No. Parallelly you need to update the B transaction, the B operations also. So now what you need to write here? Read of B, you need to first access B account, then credited amount. So how do you write here? B equal to B plus 100, because A has transferred, given. So when you are giving something, plus will be there at the B side and minus will be there at the A side. Okay, B equal to B 100 and you need to update. So here I am writing write operation. Okay, write of B. So is it enough? No. This should be reflected in the database also. When the changes has to be reflected in the database, then what is the statement you need to write? You have to write commit. You have to write commit. Okay, so unless you commit all the operations, it will not be saved in the database. Okay, so this is a transaction. All these are set of instructions, right? So again, coming back to the transaction states. So when a transaction will be in an active state? When we are starting the transaction, then that transaction will be in an active state. Okay, so a small example. So if I want to, I visited a ATM. So I want to debit 5,000 cash from my account. So what I will do? So I will go to the ATM first. I'll insert my card in the ATM machine. I will choose the language. Then I'll enter the PIN. Then the amount I want to debit. So, all these are the transactions. Okay. So, these set of operations means, am I active here? The transaction is still active. So, that is nothing but active state, right. So, all these operations when we are beginning means it is in active state. Okay. So, after that when a transaction is active, it moves to partially committed. It moves to partially committed means any transaction when we are beginning, you need to end the transaction also. Okay. So, meanwhile whatever the instructions that we are performing, those will be in a partially committed state. Okay. So, here we are, before reading A, before accessing my account, I will start my transaction. So, this entire transaction T1 will be in an active state. So, in between we are performing all these operations. Okay. Means, see here, before commit, whatever the instructions we have, those instructions will be in a partially committed state. Okay. Means all these details, where these details will be, these details will not be reflected in the database. Okay. Still those instructions will be in the RAM only. Okay. So, those instructions will be in a partially committed state. Okay. So, let me give a small summarization about the architecture here. Fine. So, here we have CPU. So, what CPU does? CPU will instruct, CPU will execute all instructions. Okay. But where the data will be there? The data will be there in secondary memory. Okay. Means in the hard disk. In the hard disk. Okay. So, what happens here? Instructions will be executed by the CPU, but how the instructions will be executed? If the secondary memory provide the data, then only CPU will execute the instructions. But here you need to make one point, you need to remember one point, that CPU executes instructions very fastly. Okay. In unit of time, it can execute millions of instructions, means it will always execute million instructions per second. Okay. But what about the secondary memory? This is always low in speed. Okay. The speed of the secondary memory is not that much compatible with the CPU. Then what we have to do? So, in between secondary memory and the CPU, we have RAM. We have RAM. Okay. So, what this RAM will do? So, RAM will provide the compatibility between CPU and the hard disk. Means what happens, because the hard disk is very slow, so whatever the instructions, whatever the present data will be there, so data, the RAM will fetch the data into the RAM and that instruction will be given to the CPU. Okay. So, RAM will ask you all the data and it will provide the data to the CPU, because CPU always executes the instructions very fastly. Okay. Now, so see here, so what happens here? So, here when we are executing all these instructions will be in the RAM only. This will not be reflected at the hard disk. Hard disk here is nothing but database. Hard disk is nothing but database. Okay. So, before, suppose I can say, if I say we have n statements, in the transaction, n-1 statements will be in a partially committed state. What is n-1 here? This is n-1. If I say I have n instructions, till n-1 it is partially committed, because these instructions will not be saved in the secondary memory, means the database. Okay. So, where it will be, until then this will be executed in the RAM only. Okay. So, the active state will be in a RAM, partially committed state will also be in RAM. Okay. So, after partially committed, what is the next state we have? Committed. So, means what the committed state? When it counters commit statement, then what happens here? The RAM will push the details of A and B to the hard disk. Okay. So initially we have A is 200 and B is 100. After this transaction, what is the value of A and B? A will be debited by 100 rupees, means A will be 100 and B will be 200. A will be 100 and B will be 200. This is the new record. This is the old values. These new records will be in committed state. Okay. So, when a transaction counters the commit statement, then the transaction is said to be in the committed state. It is said to be in a committed state. So, what do you mean by committed state? All the instructions, whatever we are updating. Okay. So, new values are updated. New values are updated. Where the new values will be updated? It will be updated in the hard disk. Okay, it will be updated in the hard disk. This is the first level. This is the first path. Okay, so first the transaction will be in active state. Then it comes to the partially committed state. Then it will come. Then it will come into the committed state. Okay, but what if when we are performing any instructions in a transaction, what if suddenly failure occurs? What if suddenly failure occurs? Okay, so then it will come into failed state. Even it can be, so we have initiated the transaction, and before we perform any instruction, so here also we can have a chance of entering into the failed state. Okay, so means here also failure occurs. Okay, failure occurs. So what are these failures? These failures can be either a software failure or hardware failure. It could be either software or hardware. So what are these software and hardware failures? So suddenly power has interrupted, or the server has gone down, or any other problem. We can have many ad hocs on the server, or else some hardware which we are using to perform a transaction, maybe those may not perform very well. So all these things which are interrupting the transaction is nothing but failures. It could be either software, maybe the software could not work properly, right? So all these comes under software and hardware failures. If by chance when we are initiating a transaction, if any one of the condition has occurred, then it will enter into the failed state. Okay, so it can be from the active state or it can be from the partially committed state also. Okay, so see here, so I have started I have initiated a transaction. So what is a transaction? Suppose I want to debit 5,000 rupees from my account. I have kept my ATM card. So after that, before entering my PIN number, so suddenly power has gone. Okay, or else any other interrupt has been occurred. So what happens? Just now I am initiating the transaction, means it is an active state. So power has gone, means some failure has occurred. So when the failure has occurred, what happens? Failed. It enters into the failed state. Okay, or else suppose I am performing some instructions, means what? I have kept a card, I have entered the PIN number, I have initiated the debit, I have initiated the transaction to debit 5,000 rupees, and after that the failure may occur. So suddenly the power has gone, or else the hardware which I am using is not working that time. Okay, so or else the server may not respond to whatever the request I am keeping. So even that is also failure, means where all the instructions I am performing, okay, means it is in a partially committed state. Even at this state also, if a failure occurs, it will be entered into the failed state. Okay, so what if the failed state? See here, I have performed read of A, I have debited 100 rupees and I have also updated the record A. Where this record will be there? In the RAM. Okay, but after this, So where until here where it will be partially committed. So after this suddenly failure has occurred. So what happens? It will be entering into the failed state. So what it will do? The failed state will abort the entire transaction. The failed state will abort the entire transaction. So why it will abort the entire transaction? It cannot resume. Okay, a transaction once it has entered into the failure state, it cannot be resumed. Okay, it cannot be resumed. Why it cannot be resumed? Why it cannot be resumed? Because we have seen the properties of a transaction that either the entire transaction should be executed or else again you need to roll back. Okay, either all or none. That is nothing but your atomicity, right? So here in the middle we have stopped the execution. Now what happens? It needs to roll back. It needs to roll back to the initial transaction. Yes or no? Just we'll take the real time example. So when you keep a card, insert a card into the ATM and you want to withdraw 5,000 rupees and suddenly failure has occurred. So what happens? Can you withdraw your amount? No, you cannot. What you will do? Again you will start from the starting step itself. Again you will get the card out of your ATM machine. Again you will keep the ATM machine. Again you will choose your language, then enter your PIN. Again 5,000 rupees will be entered. The process will be same, right? Means in the transaction you cannot resume from where the transaction has failed. Okay, because of its atomic in nature. Okay, so once after it is failed, it is entering into the failed state, then it will be terminated. Okay, so what is termination state here? So termination is nothing but whatever the resources that we are using, that has to be released to the CPU. Okay, means after committing also it will enter into the terminated state. Okay, so means after committed, what do you have? So this transaction will hold some resources, means memory will be occupied by the transaction. Okay, so why the memory is held? See here, we are accessing A, we are accessing B, some ALU operations are being performed, right? Where this ALU will be there? In the CPU. Okay, so whatever the resources that we are holding right now, that should be released. Okay, so that is nothing but terminated. When it will be terminated? After committing, means after completing your transaction, you have to release your resources back to the memory. Okay, and even after in the failed state. Okay, so why it will fail? A transaction is failed in between, or else before initiating the transaction it has failed, means even there also it is holding some resources. Even those resources also it has to get free. Okay, you need to free those resources also. Means when you are releasing the resources, means it is entering into the termination state. Now you have to be very free. Okay, so that is nothing but terminated state. Okay, so after terminated state, now even though the transaction has failed after commit, there is no problem, because already A and B has been updated in the database. Okay, and even after, suppose in between the transaction has failed, again it will enter into the terminated state. Again what happens? Again it will roll back. So rolling back is nothing but again it will start from the initial step. What happens? Again it will come to the active state, partially committed and then terminated. Okay, so understood what are the different states of transaction? Okay, so let me summarize quickly. How many states do we have in transaction? One is active state, partial committed, committed state, failed state and terminated state. Active state is nothing but when we are initiating the transaction will be, by default it will be in an active state, means we are initiating execution of the instructions. Okay. Then it will enter into the partially committed state. Why? Because any transaction what we are starting, that should come to an end. Okay. Means when it will come to an end, when we execute all the set of instructions. When it is executing this set of instructions, it will be in a partially committed state. Okay. So, after partially committed state, it will enter into the committed state. Okay. What is committed? So, when it counters commit statement in the transaction, means whatever the actions we are performing, that will be updated. Write operations are performed here. Okay. So, here write operations is performed in the committed state, means it will reflect, it will save the changes in the database. Once the changes are done, then it will enter into the terminated state. What do you mean by termination state? Whatever the resources that the transaction is holding, it has to release back. It needs to free all the resources. Okay. This is one part. And if the transaction is in active or if it is in partially committed state, we have a chance of that transaction entering into the failed state. Why it will enter into the failed state? Maybe because of the failures that is occurring in middle. It could be either software or it could be either hardware. Okay. So, failed state is nothing but again it has to resume the initial transaction or else it needs to resume the new transaction. Okay. Then it will, that is nothing but the failed state. So, after failed state it will go back to the terminated, because even in the failed state also it is holding some of the resources. So, first it has to release all the resources back to the memory and then it has to resume back, it has to roll back to the transaction. Okay. So, this is about the different states of a transaction.